At 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue stands a building that has become more symbol than structure. The white columns catch morning light, the perfectly trimmed lawns stretch toward distant monuments. Tourists gather at the iron gates, cameras ready, hoping to glimpse the building through the trees. This is the White House, the home and office of every American president since John Adams, the backdrop for countless photographs, news broadcasts, and historic moments. A building so familiar that most people feel they already know it. But there's a story beneath the white paint, a story of difficult choices and harder labor, of compromises that created a capital from nothing, of workers whose names appear in ledgers as line items, if they appear at all, of fire and reconstruction, of a building that almost wasn't built, almost burned completely, and somehow became the most recognized residence on Earth. This documentary tells that story. Not the story of presidents or state dinners or historic decisions made in its rooms, but the story of construction, of how this building came to exist in the first place. The White House rose between 1792 and 1800 on swampy ground that no one particularly wanted. It was built by workers both free and enslaved. It was designed by an Irish immigrant who adapted European architecture to American Republican ideals. It burned in 1814 and was rebuilt from its own ashes. It has been modified, expanded, updated, and maintained continuously for more than 2 centuries. Understanding how the White House was built requires understanding the nation that built it, a young country trying to establish legitimacy, a government operating with limited resources, a society that proclaimed liberty while practicing slavery. All of these contradictions shaped the building that emerged. If you're interested in the hidden histories of America's most famous buildings, please subscribe. And in the comments, let me know what surprised you most about the White House's construction. Your engagement helps make these detailed investigations possible. Let's start where every building starts, with the ground beneath it.
Chapter 1. The Compromise That Created a Capital. The United States had a problem in 1788. The new Constitution had been ratified. The federal government existed, but it had no permanent home. Congress met wherever it could. Philadelphia 1 year, New York the next, Princeton briefly, Annapolis for a session. Each temporary capital came with political baggage. Each city's residents assumed their hospitality would be rewarded with permanent status. Each was wrong. The question of where to locate the permanent capital threatened to tear apart the fragile Union before it truly began. Northern states wanted the capital in an established city. Philadelphia made sense. Central location, existing infrastructure, culture, and commerce. New York had similar arguments. Both cities wanted the prestige and economic benefit a permanent capital would bring. Southern states opposed northern capitals. They feared a capital in Philadelphia or New York would give northern commercial interests too much influence over federal policy. They wanted the capital in the South, or at least in neutral territory between North and South. The argument paralyzed Congress through 1789 and into 1790. Bills were proposed, votes failed, tempers flared. The young nation couldn't agree on something as basic as where its government would sit. The solution came through backroom dealing rather than public debate. Alexander Hamilton needed votes. His financial plan, federal assumption of state Revolutionary War debts, was stalled in Congress. Southern representatives opposed it, seeing it as a Northern scheme that would benefit states that had already paid their debts while rewarding states that hadn't. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison needed something too. They wanted the capital out of northern cities. They wanted it in the South, or at least not in the North. The deal was struck over dinner. Hamilton's financial plan would pass. In exchange, the capital would move south. The specifics of exactly where south remained vague, but the principle was established. The Residence Act of 1790 made it official. A federal district would be established along the Ptoac River, not exceeding 10 miles square. President Washington would choose the specific location within a designated area. The government would move there by 1800. Washington's selection surprised some observers. The area he chose included existing towns, Georgetown in Maryland and Alexandria in Virginia, but was largely undeveloped. The terrain was difficult. Much of the land was marshy. Potomac flooded regularly. Summers brought oppressive heat and humidity. Mosquitoes bred in standing water, and with them came disease. But Washington had reasons for his choice. The location was genuinely between North and South, roughly equidistant from the northern and southern extremes of the existing states. This geographic compromise had symbolic value. The capital would belong to no region exclusively. The location was also near Mount Vernon, Washington's plantation. He knew the area intimately. He'd surveyed land along the Potomac as a young man. He apparently believed the river could become a major transportation route linking the interior to the Atlantic coast. The capital, in his vision, would sit at the junction of commerce and government. And perhaps most practically, the land was cheap. Much of it was considered marginal, too wet for good farming, too far from established cities to command high prices. The federal government, operating with limited funds, could acquire substantial acreage without bankrupting itself. The decision to build a capital from scratch was unusual. Most national capitals evolved in existing cities. London, Paris, Rome, all were established urban centers before they became capitals. The United States was doing something different, creating a purpose-built capital on essentially blank ground. Pierre Charles L'Enfant was hired to design this new city. L'Enfant, a French engineer who'd fought in the Revolutionary War, had grand visions. Wide diagonal avenues cutting across a street grid, grand public squares at intersections, impressive vistas and carefully planned sight lines. The design drew heavily on European precedents, particularly Paris, but adapted to American circumstances. L'Enfant's plan placed the President's House and the Capitol as the two poles around which everything else would organize. Pennsylvania Avenue would connect them, a grand ceremonial route. The President's House would sit on elevated ground with views of the Potomac, visible but not dominating, impressive but not royal. The site L'Enfant and Washington selected for the President's House was the best available ground in the designated area, higher than surroundings, providing drainage, views of the river, central enough to be accessible, elevated enough to be prominent. But best available didn't mean ideal. The terrain still required extensive preparation. Drainage ditches had to be dug, the terrain had to be leveled where irregular, trees and vegetation had to be cleared. Before any building could rise, the land itself had to be made ready. The timeline was aggressive. 10 years to design a city, construct essential buildings, and create enough infrastructure for the federal government to relocate. For a building as substantial as the President's House, 10 years was barely adequate. Every delay would make the deadline harder to meet. Washington understood the challenges. He'd overseen construction projects at Mount Vernon. He knew buildings took time, required skilled labor, and often exceeded budgets. But apparently he remained committed to the Potomac location and the 1800 deadline. The compromise had been struck. The location had been chosen. Now came the harder question. What would the President's House actually look like?
Chapter 2. Designing a House for a President Who Isn't a King. In March 1792, the commissioners overseeing the federal district placed advertisements in newspapers, an architectural competition for the President's House. Designs were invited. The winner would receive $500 or a gold medal of equivalent value. The announcement created an unusual problem. No one quite knew what a Republican president's house should look like.
European precedents weren't helpful. Kings lived in palaces, Versailles, Windsor Castle, structures that announced royal power through overwhelming scale and ornamentation. But the United States had rejected monarchy. The president was an elected official, not a sovereign. The residence should reflect that distinction. But the house couldn't be too modest. The president represented the nation. Foreign dignitaries would visit. The building needed dignity sufficient to command respect internationally. A small plain house might suggest the United States was weak or unimportant. The challenge was finding the balance, impressive but not monarchical, substantial but not palatial, republican but dignified. The competition instructions tried to capture this balance. The house should accommodate both the president's family and official entertaining. It should be built of durable materials, stone or brick, not wood. It should be sized appropriately for its purposes. Beyond these basics, the instructions left interpretation to the architects. We don't know exactly how many designs were submitted. Records are incomplete. Most entries haven't survived. What's known is that the range was wide, from relatively modest proposals to elaborate structures that looked more like palaces than houses. Thomas Jefferson submitted a design anonymously. Jefferson, serving as Secretary of State, was deeply interested in architecture. He'd studied classical buildings during his time in France. His own home, Monticello, reflected his architectural ideas. Jefferson's competition entry drew on Palladio's Villa Rotonda, a 16th-century Italian building Jefferson admired. The design featured a dome, classical proportions, and restrained decoration. It emphasized horizontal lines and symmetry. The design was recognizably classical, but relatively modest in scale. The commissioners didn't select Jefferson's design. We don't know exactly why. Perhaps it seemed too derivative of European models. Perhaps the scale was too modest. Perhaps political considerations played a role. Choosing the Secretary of State's design might look like favoritism. Whatever the reasons, Jefferson's entry was set aside. Other submissions apparently included much grander proposals, designs with elaborate ornamentation, multiple wings, features that would have been more appropriate for royal palaces than republican residences. These were rejected as too monarchical, too expensive, or simply too large. The winning design came from James Hoban. Hoban was Irish-born, trained in Dublin and working in Charleston, South Carolina when the competition was announced. He was in Philadelphia on business when he learned about it and decided to enter. Hoban's design struck the balance the commissioners sought. It was substantial, 3 stories, rectangular plan with projecting wings, room for both family life and official functions, but it wasn't overwhelming. The style was Georgian, restrained neoclassical, emphasizing proportion over decoration. The design drew on Leinster House in Dublin, though it wasn't a direct copy. Hoban adapted the Irish precedent to American circumstances. The facade featured symmetrically arranged windows, a central entrance, classical details that suggested permanence without suggesting royalty. President Washington approved the selection. Washington had strong opinions about the capital's development and took active interest in major buildings. His support for Hoban's design was essential. But Washington wanted changes. The design needed to be larger. Hoban's competition entry was substantial, but Washington wanted more impressive scale. Hoban agreed to modify his plans, increasing dimensions while maintaining the basic design principles. The modifications made the building more expensive and time-consuming to construct, but they also made it more impressive, a building that could genuinely represent the nation without resembling a palace. Hoban's design solved several problems simultaneously. It used classical architecture familiar to Americans and Europeans, avoiding anything too exotic or experimental. It could be built with available materials and construction techniques. It separated public and private spaces vertically. service areas on the ground floor, public rooms on the main floor, family quarters above. The design also built in flexibility. Rooms could be assigned different purposes as needs changed. The rectangular plan with wings could be constructed in phases if necessary. The building could function before it was completely finished, important given the tight timeline. Winning the competition made Hoban more than just the architect. He became superintendent of construction, overseeing the entire building process. He would manage workers, order materials, solve problems, and adjust plans as construction proceeded. His design would guide the work, but his day-to-day decisions would determine how faithfully the design was realized. The competition established some lasting principles for American government architecture. Buildings should be classical in style, suggesting continuity with ancient republics. They should emphasize proportion and symmetry over elaborate decoration. They should be substantial enough to command respect, but restrained enough to avoid suggesting monarchy. These principles, established in 1792 for the President's House, would influence American public buildings for generations. Federal architecture would follow patterns Hoban's design established. Classical forms adapted to Republican purposes, impressive but not overwhelming, permanent but not oppressive. The design was selected, Hoban was hired, the site was prepared. Now came the actual work of construction.
Chapter 3. The Man Who Designed the White House. James Hoban arrived in America with skills and ambition, but little else. Born around 1758 in County Kilkenny, Ireland, Hoban grew up in a country where architecture was flourishing. Dublin, in particular, was experiencing a building boom. Georgian townhouses lined new streets. Public buildings rose in neoclassical style. The architectural firm Hoban trained with was part of this expansion. Georgian architecture dominated British and Irish building in the 18th century. The style emphasized symmetry, classical proportions, and restrained decoration. Buildings were designed according to mathematical principles derived from classical Roman architecture. The result was a style that looked orderly, permanent, and dignified, without being overly elaborate. Hoban learned this style thoroughly. His training included drawing, mathematics, classical theory, and practical construction knowledge. He understood how buildings went together, not just how they should look. Why Hoban left Ireland for America isn't entirely clear. Economic opportunity probably played a role. Ireland in the 1780s offered limited prospects for a young architect without aristocratic connections. America, rebuilding after the Revolutionary War, needed skilled builders. The new nation promised opportunity that Ireland didn't. Hoban settled initially in Philadelphia, then moved to Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston in the 1780s and early 1790s was prosperous. Plantation wealth supported active construction. The city's elite wanted impressive houses, and they had money to pay for them. Hoban established himself in Charleston's building trade. He designed houses for wealthy clients. He supervised construction. He built a reputation for competent work in the Georgian style. The buildings he designed in Charleston demonstrated his training. Symmetrical facades, classical details, proper proportions. When news of the President's House competition reached Charleston, Hoban was reportedly in Philadelphia on business. Learning of the competition, he decided to enter. His training and experience made him qualified. He understood classical design principles. He'd actually built substantial buildings, not just drawn plans. He could execute designs in stone or brick using available construction techniques. Hoban's winning design drew on Leinster House, a Dublin building he would have known from his time in Ireland.
Built in the 1740s for the Duke of Leinster, the building featured a rectangular plan, Georgian facade, and classical proportions similar to what Hoban proposed for the President's House. But Hoban didn't simply copy Leinster House, he adapted it. The scale was different, the specific proportions were adjusted, the details were modified for American circumstances and Republican purposes. The design was inspired by Leinster House, but was not identical to it. The design Hoban submitted featured 3 distinct levels. The ground floor, partially below grade, would house service functions, kitchens, storage, workspaces. The main floor would contain grand public rooms accessed by exterior stairs and an interior staircase. The upper floor would provide private family quarters. This vertical separation of functions was standard in Georgian design. The facade emphasized symmetry and proportion. Windows were evenly spaced. The central entrance would eventually feature a classical portico, though that wasn't built initially. Decoration was restrained, architectural details rather than sculptural elaboration. The building would achieve impressiveness through size and proportion rather than through ornament. Winning the competition changed Hoban's life. He moved to Washington and became superintendent of construction for the President's House. He would oversee every aspect of building, from foundation to finished rooms. He would manage workers, order materials, negotiate with suppliers, solve unexpected problems, and adjust plans when necessary. Hoban's relationship with President Washington influenced the project significantly. Washington wanted the building larger than Hoban's competition entry proposed. Hoban modified his plans, increasing dimensions while maintaining design principles. The changes made the building more impressive and more expensive. Hoban would spend years on the President's House project. The initial construction from 1792 to 1900, then again from 1815 to 1817, rebuilding after the fire. The building became his life's major work. The choices Hoban made shaped not just the President's House, but American government architecture generally. His use of Georgian style, his emphasis on symmetry and classical proportion, his restrained approach to decoration, all became standard for federal buildings. Hoban established patterns that government architects would follow for generations. Hoban lived in Washington for the rest of his life. He designed other buildings in the growing capital. He maintained involvement with the President's House even after initial construction finished. He became a prominent figure in the small community of early Washington. When the British burned the President's House in 1814, Hoban was the obvious choice to oversee reconstruction. He would rebuild his own design, working with surviving walls to recreate what had burned. The building that emerged from reconstruction in 1817 was fundamentally his vision realized twice, once in original construction, once in rebuilding from ruins. James Hoban died in Washington in 1831. The building he designed was by then established as the President's residence. It had housed 6 presidents. It had survived war and Reconstruction. It had become, as Hoban intended, a permanent symbol of American government. The White House today remains recognizably Hoban's design. Later additions and modifications have changed some aspects, but the basic form, the proportions, the Georgian character, all come from Hoban's 1992 competition entry. His adaptation of Irish-Georgian architecture to American Republican purposes created a building that has endured for more than 2 centuries.
Chapter 4. Laying the Foundation, October 1792. October 13, 1792. The Cornerstone Ceremony. President Washington attended, along with commissioners and local officials. The date was symbolic, anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas. The ceremony was meant to link this new building to themes of discovery and new beginnings. The cornerstone was placed somewhere in the foundation. Where exactly, no one knows anymore. Later attempts to find it during renovations have failed. The original cornerstone exists somewhere beneath the White House, its location lost to time. The ceremony was brief. The actual work of construction had already begun. Before any stone could be laid, the site required extensive preparation. The ground had to be cleared of trees and vegetation. The terrain needed leveling where irregular. Most importantly, drainage had to be addressed. The site, while elevated relative to surroundings, was still in marshy terrain. Water was a constant problem. Without proper drainage, the foundation would sit in water, leading to settling, stability problems, and eventual structural failure. Workers dug drainage ditches around the building site. These ditches would channel water away from the foundation. The system was basic but essential. The success of everything that followed depended on keeping water away from the building's base. The foundation itself was substantial. Stone walls several feet thick would support the building's weight. The foundation had to be deep enough to reach stable ground and wide enough to distribute the load of the massive structure that would sit on it. Foundation work proceeded slowly. Each stone had to be positioned carefully. Mortar had to be applied properly and allowed to cure. The work was labor-intensive and tedious, but it was absolutely critical. A building is only as solid as its foundation. Mistakes at this stage would compromise everything above. Stone for the building came from Aquia Creek quarries in Virginia, about 40 miles south along the Potomac. The Aquia Creek sandstone had several advantages. It was relatively soft, making it easier to cut and carve than harder stones. It was locally available, reducing transportation costs and complexity, and it was durable enough for construction purposes. The sandstone had a warm, tan color, not white. The president's house would not be white initially. It would be the natural color of the stone. The white paint would come much later, after the fire and reconstruction. Getting stone from quarry to building site involved complex logistics. Workers at the quarries extracted blocks by finding natural fracture lines in the stone, drilling holes, and using wedges to split blocks free. The rough blocks were then shaped somewhat at the quarry to remove obviously excess material, reducing weight for transport. The stone traveled primarily by water. Barges loaded with stone blocks moved down waterways to the Potomac, then up the Potomac to wharves near the construction site. Water transport was far more efficient than overland hauling for heavy materials. A single barge could carry multiple large stone blocks that would have required many wagon trips overland. From the river wharves, stone had to be moved to the construction site. This required wagons pulled by horses or oxen. The roads were poor, unpaved, muddy when wet, dusty when dry. Moving heavy stone blocks over these roads was difficult and slow. At the construction site, stone cutters finished the blocks to precise dimensions. This was skilled work requiring years of training. Each block had to be shaped individually, a time-consuming process that couldn't be rushed without risking errors. As foundation walls rose, the need for labor intensified. The project required workers for dozens of different tasks: mixing mortar, moving materials, positioning stones, constructing scaffolding, hauling debris, maintaining tools. The workforce that assembled was diverse in skills and legal status. Skilled craftsmen formed the core: stonecutters, masons, carpenters, blacksmiths. These workers brought years of training to their tasks. Many were free men working for wages. Some were immigrants, particularly from Britain and Ireland, bringing European training to this American project. But skilled labor alone couldn't build the president's house in the time available. The project needed large numbers of laborers for less skilled but physically demanding work. Some laborers were free workers hired at daily or weekly wages. Others were enslaved workers hired from their owners by the federal government or brought to the site by contractors who owned them. The use of enslaved labor on the President's house is documented in payroll records. The federal government paid slave owners for their workers' time. The enslaved individuals themselves received no compensation. They worked because they were forced to work. Their legal status as property made their labor available to whoever owned or hired them. This arrangement was common in Maryland and Virginia in the 1790s. Slavery was legal and widespread. The federal district was carved from slave states. Using enslaved labor on government construction projects was standard practice, not exceptional. But standard practice doesn't make it less troubling. The President's house, meant to symbolize American democracy and freedom, was being built partly by people denied freedom, treated as property, compelled to labor without compensation or choice. The foundation work continued through late 1792 and into 1793. Progress was steady but slow. Weather affected the schedule. Rain halted work. Winter cold made some tasks difficult. But gradually the foundation walls rose. By early 1793, the foundation was largely complete. The building could begin rising above ground. The groundwork had been laid, both literally and figuratively. The site was prepared. The foundation was solid. Materials were arriving. The workforce was assembled. James Hoban supervised carefully, ensuring the work met necessary standards. The President's house was beginning to take physical form, but years of difficult work still lay ahead before the building would be ready for occupancy.
Chapter 5. The Workforce, Free and Enslaved. Construction sites in the 1790s operated differently than modern projects. No heavy machinery, no power tools. Everything was done by hand, using simple tools and human muscle. Building the President's house required hundreds of workers over 8 years. Some worked for months or years. Others appeared for weeks or days before moving to other jobs. The workforce was constantly changing, creating management challenges for Hoban and the commissioners. Understanding who built the White House means examining both free workers and enslaved workers. The historical record preserves more information about free workers than enslaved ones, a pattern reflecting who was considered important enough to document fully. Skilled craftsmen were essential and relatively well documented. Stone cutters shaped the Aquia Creek sandstone into precise blocks. Masons laid stone, ensuring proper alignment and secure mortar bonds. Carpenters framed interior spaces, built floors, constructed roof structures. Plasterers finished interior walls. Blacksmiths made and repaired tools, created hardware, forged iron elements. Each skilled trade required years of training. An apprentice might spend 7 years learning a craft before becoming a journeyman. Another several years of experience were needed before being considered a master craftsman qualified to supervise others. Many skilled workers on the President's house were immigrants. Irish, Scottish, and English craftsmen came to America seeking opportunity. The new capital offered steady work on prestigious projects. Pay was regular, at least when federal funds were available. The work, while difficult, provided a living. These skilled workers generally appear in historical records by name. Payroll ledgers list individuals, their trades, work periods, and wages paid. We know their names, where they came from, sometimes what they did after working on the President's house. James Hoban, as superintendent, supervised these skilled workers directly. He assigned tasks, inspected work, and ensured quality standards were met. His knowledge of construction meant he could evaluate work technically, not just administratively. But skilled craftsmen, however essential, couldn't build the President's house alone.
The project required enormous quantities of unskilled labor for physically demanding tasks: digging foundations, moving stone, hauling materials, mixing mortar, clearing debris. This unskilled labor came from both free and enslaved workers. Free laborers worked for daily wages. The pay was modest but regular. The work was difficult and dangerous: heavy lifting, long hours, exposure to weather. But for men without specialized skills, construction labor provided income. Enslaved laborers worked because they were compelled to work. Their presence on the construction site came through two primary arrangements. Some enslaved workers were hired by the federal government from their owners. The government paid slave owners a daily or weekly rate for their workers' time. The owners were responsible for feeding, housing, and clothing their enslaved workers. The enslaved individuals themselves received no direct payment. Their labor benefited their owners, not themselves. Other enslaved workers came to the site with contractors who owned them. A free contractor might bring his own enslaved workers to perform labor under his supervision. The contractor received payment for completed work. The enslaved workers received nothing beyond what their owner chose to provide for basic maintenance. Payroll records document these arrangements. The records show payments to slave owners, often listing amounts paid and numbers of workers provided. What the records usually don't show are the names of the enslaved individuals actually doing the work. The documentation style reflected legal reality. Enslaved people were property under law. Property didn't need individual identification in the same way free people did. Records noted 5 Negro laborers or Negro carpenters without specifying individuals' names. Some names have been recovered through careful historical research. Cross-referencing various documents, payroll records, correspondence, work reports, has allowed historians to identify certain enslaved individuals by name and sometimes by specific work performed. But many remain anonymous in the historical record, their contributions documented only as aggregate labor. The working conditions on the construction site were demanding for everyone. The work was physical and often dangerous. Tools were basic. Safety provisions were minimal. Weather exposure was constant. Stone blocks weighing hundreds of pounds had to be moved by human muscle and simple mechanical aids: levers, rollers, primitive cranes. Scaffolding was wooden and sometimes unstable. Falls from height occurred. Stones could slip during lifting, crushing hands or feet. Tools could malfunction, causing injuries. Free workers could theoretically leave if conditions became intolerable, though economic necessity often kept them on the job. Enslaved workers had no such option. They worked or faced punishment. Their safety concerns were secondary to productivity. The distinction between free and enslaved labor created complex dynamics on the worksite. A free mason and an enslaved laborer might work side by side on the same wall section. A free carpenter might supervise enslaved workers carrying lumber. Some enslaved workers possessed skills, carpentry, masonry, making them technically proficient as free craftsmen, though their legal status remained unchanged. Some enslaved skilled craftsmen had specialized skills that made them particularly valuable. An enslaved carpenter who knew his trade might work with considerable independence, receiving assignments and completing them with minimal supervision. His skills were valued because they were useful, but that didn't change his enslaved status or provide a path to freedom. The presence of skilled enslaved craftsmen on the president's house reflected training systems in the slave states. Young enslaved people might be assigned to learn trades through something resembling apprenticeship. The training increased their value to their owners. An enslaved carpenter or mason could be hired out at higher rates than unskilled laborers. But the training didn't lead to freedom. A highly skilled enslaved craftsman remained enslaved regardless of ability. The skills might eventually allow purchasing freedom if the enslaved person could somehow accumulate money, but this was extremely difficult. Most skilled enslaved workers remained in bondage regardless of their abilities. The workforce that built the president's house included free immigrants seeking opportunity, skilled craftsmen practicing their trades, and enslaved people compelled to labor without compensation or choice. All contributed to raising the building. The free workers received wages and could build lives for themselves. The enslaved workers received nothing and remained in bondage. Both groups' labor made the building possible. This reality, that America's most symbolic building was constructed partly through slave labor, creates uncomfortable tension. The building represents democratic ideals and freedom. Its construction contradicted those ideals. Both facts are historically true. Understanding the full story requires acknowledging both.
Chapter 6. Rising Walls, 1793 to 1797. The stone walls rose slowly across 4 years. By 1793, the foundation was complete and the structure could begin rising above ground. The process required careful coordination. Stone had to be quarried, transported, finished, and positioned. Each step involved substantial labor and presented its own challenges. At Aquia Creek, workers extracted sandstone blocks continuously. The demand was enormous. Thousands of stone blocks would be needed before the building was complete. Quarrying was skilled and dangerous work. Workers had to read the stone, identify natural fracture lines, place wedges correctly. Mistakes could shatter blocks, wasting material and labor. The rough blocks traveled by barge to Washington. The river journey took days, depending on weather and river conditions. Boats had to be loaded carefully to prevent shifting cargo. A stone block coming loose during transport could damage other blocks or even sink a barge. At the Washington wharves, blocks were unloaded and transported to the construction site. This required wagons and teams of horses or oxen. The roads between wharf and site were basic, dirt tracks that became mud in rain. Moving heavy stone over these roads tested both equipment and the patience of workers. At the site, stone cutters finished each block to exact specifications. The facade blocks required particular attention. These stones needed smooth outer surfaces and precise edges. They would be visible in the finished building. Any imperfections would be permanent flaws in the facade. The stone cutters worked from patterns showing required dimensions. Each block was individual, sized and shaped for a specific location. The work couldn't be rushed. A poorly cut block might not fit properly, requiring replacement at considerable expense of time and material. As finished blocks accumulated, masons began laying them in walls. This required skill and constant attention to detail. Each block had to be positioned precisely, leveled, and secured with mortar. The mortar itself, made from lime, sand, and water, had to be properly mixed. Too thin and it wouldn't bond. Too thick and it would be difficult to work. The masons checked their work constantly. Levels ensured horizontal courses stayed level. Plumb lines ensured vertical surfaces rose straight. The accumulating weight of stone above meant any misalignment in lower courses would be magnified higher up. The walls rose in sections. Workers focused on bringing one area to a certain height before moving to adjacent sections. This approach allowed efficient use of scaffolding and equipment. It also distributed the building's weight more evenly as construction proceeded, reducing risk of settling problems. Interior walls rose alongside exterior walls. Interior walls were typically brick rather than stone. Brick was cheaper and adequate for interior purposes. Bricklayers worked simultaneously with stonemasons, creating the interior structure that would divide the building into rooms and support upper floors.
The work proceeded regardless of season, though weather significantly affected productivity. Rain could halt mortar work, which required dry conditions. Winter cold could freeze mortar before it cured properly, compromising bond strength. Summer heat was exhausting for workers doing physical labor, reducing productivity. Despite weather challenges, construction continued year-round. The deadline pressure was constant. The government was supposed to move to Washington in 1800. The president's house needed to be at least minimally habitable by then. Every delay made the deadline harder to meet. The workforce composition remained mixed throughout the wall construction phase. Free, skilled workers, masons and stonecutters particularly, were essential for quality work. Enslaved laborers provided much of the muscle power for moving materials and assisting skilled workers. The mix of free and enslaved labor continued to create ethical tensions inherent in the project. The building rising from the Potomac ground was meant to house the president of a nation founded on principles of liberty and equality, yet enslaved people denied liberty and treated as unequal under law were helping build it. By 1795, the walls had reached full height in some sections. The building's intended form was becoming visible. Visitors to the site could see how large the structure would be, though extensive work remained before it would be weatherproof. By 1796, the basic structure was taking recognizable shape. The rectangular plan with projecting wings was clear. The window openings were defined. The building looked like a building rather than just a construction site. But appearances were somewhat deceptive. The exterior walls might be rising toward completion, but the interior was still largely empty. Floors hadn't been built, interior partitions hadn't been erected, the roof wasn't on. The building was a shell, impressive from outside, but far from functional inside. The Aquia Creek sandstone itself presented ongoing challenges. The stone was relatively soft, which made it easier to work, but also made it vulnerable to weathering. Exposed surfaces could degrade before the building was even complete. Some blocks needed replacement because weathering damaged them before they were fully protected by the completed structure. Safety remained a constant concern throughout this period. Workers labored at increasing heights as walls rose. Scaffolding became more elaborate and potentially more dangerous. Stone blocks were hoisted overhead using simple cranes and rope systems. If a block slipped during hoisting, workers below were at risk. Records of specific accidents are scarce, but the dangerous nature of the work was accepted as normal. Construction in the 18th century was hazardous. Workers died or were injured regularly. The president's house construction likely saw its share of accidents, though they weren't documented in detail. By 1797, the exterior walls stood essentially complete. The building's footprint and exterior form were established. The building was becoming what James Hoban had designed 5 years earlier. But the exterior completion was only part of the work. The roof had to be built. Interior floors and partitions had to be constructed. Finishing work had to be done. The building might look impressive from outside, but it was years from being habitable. The walls were up. The harder work of finishing was about to begin.
Chapter 7. Inside the Shell. Interior Construction. With exterior walls complete by 1797, attention shifted to making the building functional. Walls alone don't create a usable space. The interior had to be divided into rooms. Floors had to be built. A roof had to go on. Only then would the structure be weatherproof and potentially habitable. The roof structure came first. The building needed weather protection before interior finishing could proceed. The roof framing used timber, the standard construction material for the period. Massive wooden beams would support the roof's weight and transfer it to the stone walls below. The timber came from forests in the region: oak, pine, chestnut. Trees were felled, transported to sawmills, cut to dimension, and delivered to the construction site.
Carpenters erected the roof framing piece by piece. This was skilled work requiring knowledge of structural principles and joint construction. Beams had to be precisely cut and fitted. Joints had to be strong enough to hold under the roof's weight and wind loads. The roof structure rose above the walls in sections. As each section was completed, workers could begin installing the roof covering, initially slate, a durable material that would last for decades. The slate came from quarries, shipped as flat tiles that had to be individually positioned and secured. Installing a slate roof was time-consuming. Each tile had to be nailed to wooden strips laid across the roof framing. The tiles overlapped to shed water. Properly installed, a slate roof would keep the building dry for generations. Poorly installed, it would leak constantly. With the roof on, the building was weatherproof. Rain and snow would no longer fall directly into the interior. This allowed interior work to proceed without weather interruptions. The interior structure required more timber framing. Floor joists would span between walls, supporting floorboards above. The joists had to be sized appropriately for the spans they covered and the loads they would carry. The main floor, which would hold large numbers of people during official events, needed particularly strong support. Carpenters installed floor joists level by level. The ground floor went in first, creating a working platform for construction above, then the main floor, then the second floor. Each level provided staging for work on the level above. Floorboards went down on top of the joists. Wide wooden planks covered each floor. The boards had to fit tightly together to prevent drafts and provide smooth surfaces. In the principal rooms, the ones that would be most visible, the floorboards needed to be particularly well fitted and smooth. Interior partitions divided the vast shell into rooms. These walls were typically brick or thick plaster over wooden lath. The partitions created the room layout Hoban had designed, the large public spaces like the East Room, the State Dining Room, and the smaller rooms for various purposes. Building interior partitions required careful measurement. Room dimensions had to match the plans. Walls had to be plumb and properly aligned. Doorways had to be positioned correctly and framed strongly enough to support their weight and the weight of door hardware. The interior construction proceeded slowly. Each trade had to complete its work before the next could begin. Carpenters had to finish framing before plasterers could start. Plasterers had to finish walls before painters could work. The sequence couldn't be rushed without creating problems. Plastering was particularly time-consuming. Interior walls received multiple coats of plaster. The first coat provided a base. Subsequent coats built up smooth surfaces. The final coat had to be especially smooth and even. In the principal rooms, decorative plasterwork added architectural interest, moldings, ceiling designs, elaborate details around doors and windows. Plasterwork required dry conditions. The material had to cure properly between coats. In humid Washington summers, drying took longer. In winter, if the building wasn't adequately heated, plaster could freeze before curing, ruining the work. The principal rooms received the most elaborate finishing. The East Room, designed as the largest and most impressive space, would have high ceilings, large windows, and elaborate plaster details. The State Dining Room needed similar treatment. This was where the president would host official dinners, and the room had to look appropriately dignified. Other rooms received simpler finishings appropriate to their functions. Private family quarters didn't need the same elaboration as public spaces. Service areas needed functional finishes, not decorative ones. Windows and doors had to be installed throughout. Each window opening needed frames, sashes, and glass. The glass came from Europe. American glass manufacturing wasn't yet capable of producing the quantities and quality needed. The imported glass was expensive and had to be handled carefully during installation. Doors were substantial, thick wood hung on iron hinges. The principal rooms needed particularly impressive doors, both for appearance and to provide acoustic separation when multiple events occurred simultaneously in different spaces. Fireplaces were essential for heating. Each major room needed at least one fireplace. The chimneys rose through the building, their flues serving fireplaces on multiple floors. Each fireplace needed a hearth, a surround, and a mantel. In the principal rooms, the mantels were architectural features in their own right, carved wood or stone surrounds that added to the room's character. The chimney construction was complex. Multiple flues had to rise through limited space without interfering with each other. The flues had to draw properly. Poor design would cause smoky rooms. The chimney masonry had to be sound. Cracks could allow fire to spread into walls. Installing all these interior elements required coordinating multiple trades. Carpenters, bricklayers, plasterers, glaziers, painters, and metalworkers all had to work in sequence. Hoban managed this coordination, scheduling work to keep trades from interfering with each other while maintaining progress. By late 1999, the building was taking recognizable interior form. Rooms existed, floors were in place, the roof kept weather out, but the building was far from finished. Much plastering remained incomplete. Painting hadn't begun in many areas. The East Room was essentially a bare shell, walls and floor, but no finishing work. The deadline pressure was intense. The government was supposed to move to Washington in 1800. The president's house needed to be habitable, even if not completely finished. The focus shifted to completing enough rooms for basic occupancy, while leaving other areas for future work. The compromise was pragmatic, but created problems. The first president to occupy the building would move into what was essentially an active construction site. Some rooms would be finished enough to use, others would be bare or incomplete. The grand vision Hoban had designed would only be partially realized when the building first opened.
Chapter 8. The Enslaved Craftsman. Skills Without Freedom. Among the enslaved workers on the president's house, some possessed specialized skills that made them essential to construction. These weren't just laborers performing heavy physical tasks, these were craftsmen who had learned trades requiring years of training. Enslaved carpenters worked throughout the project. Carpentry was one of the most common skilled trades among enslaved workers in the late 18th century. A young enslaved person might be assigned to learn carpentry through something resembling apprenticeship, working alongside an experienced carpenter, learning techniques through observation and practice. The training made economic sense for slave owners. An enslaved carpenter could be hired out at substantially higher rates than an unskilled laborer. The carpenter's skills made him more valuable property, generating more income for his owner. But the skills didn't change the carpenter's legal status. An enslaved carpenter was still enslaved, still property, still denied freedom and basic rights regardless of ability. On the president's house, enslaved carpenters performed the same work as free carpenters. They framed walls, built floors, constructed roof structures, installed doors and windows. The quality of their work had to meet the same standards. An improperly framed wall would fail, regardless of whether the carpenter who built it was free or enslaved. Some enslaved workers functioned as masons or worked under master masons. Masonry required particular skills, understanding how to lay brick or stone, how to work with mortar, how to maintain proper alignment. These skills took time to learn and practice to perfect. An enslaved mason on the president's house might work alongside free masons, performing identical tasks under the same supervision. The difference wasn't in the work performed or the skills required. The difference was in legal status and who benefited from the labor. The historical record preserves some information about enslaved craftsmen on the project, though documentation is frustratingly incomplete. Payroll records show payments to slave owners for Negro carpenters or Negro masons, but rarely name the enslaved individuals actually doing the work. This documentation style reflected how enslaved people existed in legal and social structures. They were property, not individuals with full legal standing. Records tracked property ownership and transactions, not the property itself.
A slave owner hiring out 5 carpenters would be documented. The 5 carpenters themselves might be mentioned only as a count. Cross-referencing various historical documents has allowed modern researchers to recover some names. Careful examination of payroll records, correspondence, work reports, and other archives has identified certain enslaved individuals by name and sometimes by specific work they performed. But many remain anonymous. Their contributions are documented in aggregate, enslaved labor on the President's House, but their individual identities are lost. The working conditions for enslaved craftsmen differed somewhat from those of unskilled enslaved laborers, though both groups remained in bondage. And skilled enslaved craftsmen might have slightly better conditions because his specialized abilities made him more valuable to his owner. An injured or sick skilled worker represented greater economic loss than an unskilled laborer. This created some incentive for owners to provide adequate care, though the motivations were economic rather than humanitarian. The owner wanted to protect his investment, not necessarily to benefit the enslaved person. Some enslaved craftsmen worked with considerable autonomy. A skilled carpenter who knew his trade might receive assignments and complete them with minimal supervision. This relative independence was limited and could be revoked at any time, but it represented a small degree of control over daily work that unskilled laborers lacked. The relationship between free and enslaved craftsmen on the worksite was complex. They performed similar work and needed to coordinate their efforts. A Freemason and an enslaved mason working on the same wall section had to communicate and cooperate. But their legal statuses created fundamental inequality that pervaded every interaction. The free craftsman could leave the job if he chose. The enslaved craftsman could not. The free craftsman's wages were his own. The enslaved craftsman's compensation went to his owner. Some enslaved craftsmen working with considerable autonomy. A skilled carpenter who knew his trade might receive assignments and complete them with minimal supervision. This relative independence was limited and could be revoked at any time, but it represented a small degree of control over daily work that unskilled laborers lacked. The relationship between free and enslaved craftsmen on the worksite was complex. They performed similar work and needed to coordinate their efforts. A Freemason and an enslaved mason working on the same wall section had to communicate and cooperate. But their legal statuses created fundamental inequality that pervaded every interaction. The free craftsman could leave the job if he chose. The enslaved craftsman could not. The free craftsman's wages were his own. The enslaved craftsman's compensation went to his owner. Some enslaved craftsmen working with considerable autonomy. A skilled carpenter who knew his trade might receive assignments and complete them with minimal supervision. This relative independence was limited and could be revoked at any time, but it represented a small degree of control over daily work that unskilled laborers lacked. The skills that enslaved craftsmen possessed were valuable, but offered limited path to freedom. A highly skilled enslaved craftsman might hope to eventually purchase his freedom, but this required accumulating money from small allowances or side work, a nearly impossible task. Most enslaved craftsmen remained in bondage regardless of their abilities. Their skills benefited their owners, not themselves. The training they received increased their value as property without changing their fundamental status. The contribution of enslaved craftsmen to the President's House was substantial. Their carpentry work, their masonry, their knowledge of their trades, all went into the building's construction. Without their contributions, the project would have taken longer and cost more, assuming it could have been completed at all given the labor constraints of the period. Modern efforts to acknowledge these contributions have increased in recent decades. Historians have worked to recover names and document roles. The White House Historical Association has sponsored research examining construction records and supporting efforts to identify enslaved workers individually when possible. The objective is moving beyond acknowledging slavery's role generally to documenting specific individuals' contributions whenever records allow. Each recovered name represents an individual whose story can be told, whose contribution can be acknowledged, whose existence can be recognized rather than erased. Physical recognition has appeared as well. Historical markers now acknowledge enslaved workers' contributions. Educational materials discuss their role directly. Tours of the White House include this history rather than omitting it. These efforts can't change the historical injustice. They can't free people who died in bondage centuries ago. But they can ensure the history isn't forgotten or minimized. The enslaved workers who helped build the White House existed as real individuals with skills, lives, and families. Their contributions were essential. Their stories, to the extent they can be recovered, deserve telling.
Chapter 9. John Adams moves into an unfinished house. November 1st, 1800. President John Adams arrived in Washington and moved into the President's house. The building was not ready. Construction had been ongoing for 8 years. The exterior was complete. The stone walls stood, the roof was on, windows and doors were installed. From outside, the building looked finished, impressive, exactly what Hoban had designed. But the interior told a different story. Many rooms lacked plaster on the walls. The East Room, the building's largest and most impressive space, was completely unfinished. No plaster, no paint, essentially just bare walls, exposed framing, and floorboards. The room was unusable for its intended purpose. Other rooms were in various states of completion. Some were finished enough to be functional, though barely. Others remained unfinished shells. The main staircase was usable, but lacked finished railings and decorative elements. Adams had little choice about the timing. The federal government was making its official move from Philadelphia to Washington. Congress would meet in the incomplete Capitol building. The president would occupy the incomplete President's house. The move was driven by the Residence Act's schedule rather than by the building's actual readiness. Adams's wife Abigail arrived a few days later. Her letters home provide the best contemporary description of what the house was like that first winter. She found the building cold. The house was enormous, far larger than any previous presidential residence. Many fireplaces weren't yet functional because chimneys weren't finished or had construction problems. The few working fireplaces struggled to heat the vast spaces. Washington in late fall was cold and damp. The president's house, with its high ceilings and large rooms, was difficult to keep warm even with all fireplaces working. With only some functional, the building was genuinely uncomfortable. Abigail wrote about using the East Room to hang laundry. The enormous unfinished space was good for nothing else. Wet clothes could be hung on lines stretched across the room, taking advantage of the space and whatever heat rose from rooms below. It was practical use of an otherwise useless room, but hardly what had been envisioned for the building's grandest space. The grounds around the house were undeveloped. The construction site remained visible, materials, equipment, and work areas scattered around the property. The roads in the immediate area were poor. The grand setting Hoban had envisioned existed more as a potential than reality. Furniture was scarce. The federal government had limited budget for furnishing the president's house. Some furniture came from Philadelphia, moved from the president's residence there. But the quantity was insufficient for the many rooms. Some rooms stood completely empty. Others had minimal furnishing. The house felt cavernous and incomplete. Staff accommodations were inadequate. The ground floor service areas were functional but basic. Housing for servants and staff wasn't sufficient for the number of people needed to operate even a partially functional president's house. The organization and operation of the household during that first winter was reportedly chaotic. Despite the difficulties, Adams attempted to use the house for official purposes. He received visitors, though entertaining was limited by the house's incomplete state. The partially completed public rooms could be used when necessary, but formal entertaining on any significant scale wasn't practical given the conditions.
The timeline that had driven construction, moving the government to Washington by 1800, had been met technically. The president's house was occupied, but meeting the deadline had required accepted occupancy of a building that wasn't truly ready. Workers continued construction and finishing throughout Adams's occupancy. The presence of the president in the building complicated the work, but didn't stop it. Construction crews and presidential household had to coexist in the same structure, creating predictable conflicts over space and access. Adams's presidency ended in March 1901. He lost the election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson. Adams left Washington quickly after Jefferson's inauguration, reportedly departing from dawn to avoid the ceremony. Adams's time in the president's house was brief, only about 4 months. His experience was largely unsatisfactory, given the building's incomplete state. He lived in a grand but incomplete structure during one of Washington's coldest, dampest seasons. But Adams's occupancy established that the building was technically habitable, if far from comfortable. Later presidents would occupy a house that, while still requiring ongoing work, was more complete and more functional. The gap between ambitious architectural plans and practical reality had been exposed. The president's house was designed to be impressive and dignified. In November 1800, it was impressive externally, but internally it was still very much a work in progress. The vision existed, the building existed, but the vision wasn't yet fully realized in the building. That would take more time, more work, and eventually reconstruction after disaster.
Chapter 10. Jefferson's Modifications and Completions. Thomas Jefferson became the third president and the second to occupy the president's house when he took office in March 1801. Jefferson brought unique qualifications to living in this particular building. He had architectural training and strong opinions about design. He'd submitted his own entry in the 1792 competition. Though his design hadn't been selected, his interest in architecture continued. Jefferson found the house still incomplete when he moved in. The finishing work that had been barely begun during Adams's brief occupancy continued slowly. Jefferson took active interest in completing the building and modifying some aspects to suit his preferences and needs. One of Jefferson's significant contributions was developing the east and west terraces. Hoban's original design had included some provision for subsidiary wings or connections, but Jefferson expanded and formalized these elements. The terraces extended from the main house toward east and west, creating covered walkways and additional service spaces. The east terrace connected the house to service buildings. The west terrace provided similar function on the opposite side. These terraces served multiple practical purposes. They provided covered passages between the main house and support buildings, protecting people and materials from weather. They created additional space for storage and service functions. They also improved the building's visual composition, extending its horizontal reach and connecting it more effectively to the surrounding landscape. The terrace design reflected Jefferson's interest in classical architecture. The covered walkways featured classical columns, referencing Roman and Italian precedents. Jefferson had traveled extensively in Europe during his diplomatic service and had studied classical architecture. His additions to the president's house drew on that knowledge. Jefferson also worked to complete interior spaces that had remained unfinished. The East Room finally received plaster and paint during his administration, though it remained sparsely furnished. Other rooms were finished and furnished gradually. The house became more complete and more functional during Jefferson's 8 years in residence. The grounds received attention as well. Jefferson was interested in landscape design and wanted the president's house to sit in appropriate surroundings. Gardens were planned and planted. The area around the house gradually became less construction site and more designed landscape.
Trees were planted, paths were laid out. The setting began matching the building's architectural ambitions. Jefferson modified some interior spaces to accommodate his interests and working style. He maintained natural history collections, specimens, maps, scientific instruments. Rooms in the president's house were adapted to house these collections and to serve as working spaces for Jefferson's various intellectual pursuits. The building's functionality improved during Jefferson's presidency, partly through simple completion of planned elements, but also through modifications that addressed practical problems discovered during initial occupancy. The heating issues that plagued Adams were partly addressed through completion of chimney systems and improved fireplace construction. Jefferson's democratic ideals influenced how he used the house. He was reportedly uncomfortable with excessive formality and preferred relatively accessible interactions with citizens. The house's grand scale and formal spaces existed in some tension with Jefferson's political philosophy. He navigated this by using the spaces more informally than some later presidents would. During Jefferson's presidency, Washington itself developed gradually. The president's house was no longer an isolated structure in largely undeveloped terrain. Buildings appeared nearby. Pennsylvania Avenue developed into a recognizable street connecting the president's house and Capitol. The city L'Enfant and Washington had imagined began taking physical form. The president's house benefited from this broader development. Better roads improved access. Nearby construction provided workforce when needed for ongoing work on the president's residence. The house began existing in an actual urban context rather than in relative isolation. Jefferson left office in 1809 after 2 terms. By then, the president's house was substantially more complete than when Adams first occupied it. Interior spaces were finished. The terraces added functional space and architectural interest. The grounds were beginning to look designed rather than incidental. The building Hoban had designed was closer to full realization, but the president's house would continue evolving. Each president would make modifications driven by changing needs, tastes, and circumstances. Hoban's design provided the framework, but the building would never be truly finished in the sense of being static and unchanging. Jefferson's tenure demonstrated that the president's house would be a living building, continuously adapted to its occupants' needs. The modifications he made became part of the building's history, layers added to Hoban's original design.
Chapter 11. Fire and Destruction. August 24, 1814. The War of 1812 brought disaster to Washington. On August 24, 1814, British forces entered the city and systematically burned government buildings. The attack was retaliation for American forces burning buildings in York, Canada, the previous year. The British targeted symbols of American government, the Capitol, the Treasury, and the President's House. President James Madison had received warnings that British forces were approaching. American militia attempted to defend Washington, but were defeated at the Battle of Bladensburg on August 24. The loss left Washington essentially undefended. Madison and his cabinet fled the city. First Lady Dolly Madison remained at the president's house longer, working to save important items before evacuating. Dolly Madison's actions during those final hours became legendary. She oversaw removal of important documents, including copies of the Declaration of Independence. She also ordered the rescue of the full-length portrait of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart that hung in the state dining room. The painting was too large to remove easily from its frame. According to accounts, the frame was broken and the canvas was removed and rolled for transport. The rescued portrait remains in the White House today, one of the few original objects to survive the burning.
The items Dolly Madison saved represented more than valuable property. They were symbols of the young nation's history and continuity. Her determination to preserve these items, even as British forces approached, demonstrated both personal courage and understanding of their symbolic importance. After the evacuation, British forces entered the President's house. Contemporary accounts suggest the soldiers found the house still set for dinner, with food and wine on the table. British officers reportedly ate the prepared meal before beginning the destruction. This detail, whether fully accurate or somewhat embellished in later retellings, added to the narrative of violation. The British forces had entered the president's home, consumed his dinner, then burned his house. The British set fires in multiple rooms throughout the building. They used combustible materials to ensure thorough burning. The wooden interior structure, floors, framing, and roof burned intensely. The heat was sufficient to crack stone in some areas. The fire consumed furniture, interior finishes, and essentially everything combustible within the structure. The exterior walls survived largely intact. Stone doesn't burn, though extreme heat can damage it. The walls that had taken years to construct and position remained standing, blackened by smoke and damaged by heat, but structurally sound. The survival of the exterior walls would prove crucial for reconstruction. Without them, rebuilding would have required starting essentially from nothing. With surviving walls, reconstruction could proceed faster and cheaper. The British also burned the east and west terraces Jefferson had built. The wooden elements of these structures burned. Some portions collapsed. The systematic destruction was thorough and deliberate. Other government buildings burned the same night. The Capitol was torched, both the House and Senate chambers destroyed. The Treasury building burned. The War Department building was targeted. The destruction of government structures was meant to humiliate the United States and demonstrate British power. The fires burned through the night of August 24. Contemporary accounts described the glow visible for miles. The British intended the burning to send a message. America had attacked British territory. Britain could strike back at the American capital itself. Weather helped limit the destruction. A thunderstorm moved through Washington on August 25, producing heavy rain and possibly a tornado. The rain helped extinguish fires that might otherwise have burned even more thoroughly. The storm also reportedly convinced British commanders to begin withdrawing, fearing being trapped by American forces gathering in the area. The British withdrawal left Washington a damaged city. The president's house stood as a burned shell. The Capitol was ruined. Multiple other structures were destroyed or damaged. The young nation's capital had been attacked and severely damaged. When Madison and other officials returned to Washington, they confronted the extent of destruction. The president's house was uninhabitable. The Madisons moved to temporary quarters, first the Octagon House, then other locations. The question immediately arose: rebuild or abandon Washington as the capital? Some voices suggested moving the capital to another city. Philadelphia or another established urban center might be more defensible and wouldn't require expensive reconstruction. The debate was serious enough that the decision to rebuild in Washington wasn't automatic. The choice to rebuild in Washington was significant. It represented determination that the capital would remain where it had been established, despite the British attack. Rebuilding the president's house became both practical necessity and symbolic act. Restoring the building would demonstrate that the United States would not be defeated or intimidated. James Hoban, the original architect, was brought back to oversee reconstruction. Hoban had remained in Washington after initial construction and had worked on other projects in the growing capital. His knowledge of the original structure made him the logical choice to direct rebuilding. The burned President's House stood as a ruin through the remainder of 1814 and into 1815. The structure was unstable in places. Assessment was needed to determine which portions could be salvaged and which required rebuilding. The burning of the President's House in 1814 was traumatic for the young nation, but the decision to rebuild and to rebuild in the same location using the same basic design represented resilience. The President's House would rise again.
Chapter 12. Reconstruction. Rising from ashes. Reconstruction of the President's House began in earnest in 1815, though planning and assessment had been ongoing since the fire. James Hoban returned as superintendent of reconstruction. He would essentially rebuild his own design, working with the surviving exterior walls to recreate what had burned. The first task was assessing damage and determining what could be salvaged. The interior sandstone walls had survived, but were smoke-damaged and heat-cracked in places. Some stone needed replacement. Other sections could be repaired and reused. The foundation was intact. The underground structure had been protected from the fire's worst effects. The interior had been completely destroyed. All wooden framing, floors, stairs, everything combustible was gone. The rebuilding would essentially recreate the interior from foundation up. This provided opportunity to make some improvements based on experience with the original structure. Hoban could modify details, improve systems, and correct problems identified during the building's first years of use. But the basic design would follow his original plans. Funding came through congressional appropriation. The cost was significant, though less than building entirely new would have been since the exterior walls survived. Congress allocated money in stages, initial appropriations for emergency stabilization and planning, followed by larger sums for actual reconstruction. The workforce for reconstruction included both returning workers who had built the original structure and new laborers and craftsmen. Some of the same challenges that faced original construction reappeared: sourcing materials, transporting them to the site, organizing skilled and unskilled labor. Stone for repairs came again from Aquia Creek quarries. Replacement blocks had to match existing stone in appearance and properties. Matching color and texture required careful selection. Stonecutters had to shape replacement blocks to blend with the original work so repairs wouldn't be obviously visible. The interior framing used timber as the original had. The wooden beams, joists, and roof structure were rebuilt following the original design, but with some improvements in construction techniques. The framing proceeded floor by floor, each level providing platform for work on the level above. Plastering interior walls came after framing was complete. The plasterwork recreated the original room finishes, including decorative elements in principal rooms. This work was time-consuming and required dry conditions for proper curing. Some modifications were incorporated during reconstruction. Hoban made improvements to mechanical systems and room arrangements based on experience with the original building. The changes were generally minor, refining rather than fundamentally altering the design. The goal was restoring the building to its intended function while correcting problems identified during its first use. The burned timbers and debris from the original interior had been cleared before reconstruction began. This clearing revealed the extent of damage and allowed assessment of foundation and lower wall portions. The clearing work itself was substantial, removing massive quantities of charred wood, ash, and debris. As reconstruction progressed, the building gradually regained its form. The roof went on, making the structure weatherproof. Windows were installed. Interior walls divided the space into rooms. The building's outline and basic character remained the same before the fire, but everything was new construction, replicating what had burned. The work proceeded through 1815, 1816, and into 1817. Progress was steady but required time. Rushing would risk poor workmanship or construction failures. Hoban supervised carefully, ensuring the rebuilding met proper standards. By late 1817, the President's House was sufficiently complete for occupancy. President James Monroe and his family moved into the rebuilt structure. The house was functional, though some finishing work continued into 1818 and beyond. The reconstruction represented substantial achievement. A building that had taken 8 years to construct originally had been rebuilt in approximately 3 years. The exterior walls made this possible, providing the structural framework for rapid interior reconstruction. The rebuilt President's House was fundamentally the same building Hoban had originally designed. The form, proportions, and arrangement of spaces all followed the original plan, but it was also new. With all interior elements reconstructed, the building retained its original character while being essentially rebuilt from the interior out. One significant change did occur during or shortly after reconstruction. The building was painted white.
Chapter 13. Why White? The Paint and the Name. The President's House had been constructed of Aquia Creek sandstone, which had a natural tan or light brown color. The building was this natural stone color when first completed and when John Adams and Thomas Jefferson occupied it. The fire of 1814 left the exterior walls smoke-stained and damaged. The sandstone, while structurally sound, was discolored. The stone had darkened from smoke. In some areas, intense heat had affected the stone's surface. The walls needed attention beyond just structural repair. The decision to paint the building white during reconstruction was partly practical. The paint covered smoke damage and discoloration. It created a uniform appearance even when stones varied in color or quality. It protected the stone from further weathering. White paint was also relatively inexpensive and readily available. The color had symbolic appeal as well, suggesting freshness, renewal, and new beginnings after the fire's destruction. The painting occurred during or shortly after Reconstruction in 1815 to 1817. Sources vary on exact timing, but the building was painted white as part of the restoration work. The transformation was immediate and striking. The paint used was lead-based white paint, standard for the period. Lead paint was durable and provided good coverage. The toxic properties of lead weren't well understood at the time. Lead paint would continue to be used on the building for many years before its dangers became recognized. Maintaining the white appearance required periodic repainting. Weather degraded paint surfaces, particularly Washington's humid summers and variable winters. The building needed repainting every few years to maintain its appearance. This ongoing maintenance became standard practice. The name White House emerged gradually in popular usage. In early years, the building was typically called the President's House or Executive Mansion in official documents. The informal name, White House, appeared in correspondence and newspapers, possibly as early as the 1810s or 1820s, but wasn't universally adopted. The nickname was descriptive and straightforward. The building was painted white, and it was the President's House. The name distinguished it from the Capitol and other government buildings. The simplicity made it memorable, and it stuck in popular usage, even when official documents used more formal names. Theodore Roosevelt officially adopted White House as the building's name in 1901, using it on official stationery and in White House communications. Before then, various names coexisted in both official and popular usage. Roosevelt's adoption made White House the standard designation. The timing was significant, occurring over 80 years after the building was first painted white.
The physical transformation happened during Reconstruction. The nominal transformation happened gradually over subsequent decades. Official adoption came much later. The white color and the name are both now so identified with the building that imagining it otherwise requires historical awareness. The tan sandstone building that John Adams occupied became the white building that every president since Monroe has occupied. The decision to paint the building white, initially practical and aesthetic, had lasting consequences. The color became defining. The informal name derived from that color eventually became official. A choice made during Reconstruction became a permanent characteristic. The president's house became the White House through paint and time and popular adoption. The name would eventually expand beyond just the building itself. The White House now refers to the presidency, the executive branch, the administration. What started as a simple descriptive nickname became shorthand for American executive power.
Chapter 14. Evolution through the 19th Century. After Reconstruction in 1817, the White House continued evolving through the 19th century. Various presidents made modifications, added technological improvements, and adapted the building to changing needs. One of the most significant architectural additions came in the 1820s. The north portico, the columned entrance facing Pennsylvania Avenue, was completed in 1829 during Andrew Jackson's presidency. The portico had been part of Holbein's original design, but hadn't been built during initial construction or immediate reconstruction. Adding it completed the building's north facade as originally envisioned. The classical portico, with its columns, created a more impressive entrance sequence. The addition made the building more recognizably neoclassical in character. The south portico was added in 1824 during James Monroe's presidency. This semicircular portico with columns created a distinctive south facade and provided covered outdoor space accessible from the main floor rooms. Both porticos were constructed following Holbein's original design concepts. The additions enhanced the building's appearance and provided functional benefits. They also made the building more clearly classical. The columned porches were distinctly Roman in inspiration. Interior modifications occurred continuously throughout the century. Various presidents redecorated rooms, changed furniture, modified room uses, and adapted spaces to their preferences. The flexibility of the interior allowed these changes without major structural alteration. Technological improvements transformed how the building functioned. Running water and improved plumbing were gradually installed, replacing original, simpler systems. Indoor plumbing and water closets improved sanitation and convenience. These improvements occurred in stages across several decades as technology developed. Gas lighting was installed in the 1840s, replacing candles and oil lamps. The gas system required infrastructure throughout the building. The improvement provided better, more reliable lighting. Electric lighting arrived in the 1990s during Benjamin Harrison's presidency. The installation was gradual. The family was reportedly initially afraid to touch switches. The transition from gas to electric took years to complete throughout the building. Heating systems improved across the century. Original fireplace heating was supplemented and eventually partially replaced by central heating. These improvements addressed complaints from early occupants about the building being cold and drafty. The grounds around the White House developed considerably. Gardens were designed and planted. The landscape was shaped into deliberate compositions. Various first ladies took particular interest in the grounds, commissioning plantings and improvements that reflected their tastes. Security considerations led to changes as the century progressed. The White House initially was relatively accessible. As security concerns grew, particularly after presidential assassinations, access became more controlled.
Gates, fences, and guardhouses were added or modified. The expansion of the federal government and the presidency's growing administrative burden created pressure for more office space. The White House wasn't designed primarily as an office building, but presidents needed space to work, and staff needed accommodations. Interior rooms were increasingly adapted for office use. The tension between the building's residential character and its function as executive office grew across the century. By the late 1800s, this tension was becoming acute. The president's family lived on the second floor, while staff worked in adjacent rooms. The mixing of residential and office functions created practical problems. By the late 1800s, the White House showed the cumulative effects of continuous occupation and various modifications. The building needed maintenance and updating. The structure, rebuilt after 1814, had been used for over 80 years. Wear was visible. Systems were aging. A more comprehensive renovation would become necessary in the 20th century. The 19th century modifications, taken together, represented ongoing adaptation. The basic structure remained, but the building evolved continuously. Each addition or improvement responded to contemporary needs while building on what existed. The White House in 1900 was recognizably Hoban's design, but had been substantially modified by decades of use and adaptation.
Chapter 15. Acknowledging the Builders, Remembering the Enslaved. For most of American history, the contribution of enslaved workers to building the White House received little formal recognition. The historical narrative focused on presidents who occupied the building, architects who designed it, and the symbolic role it played in American government. The laborers, particularly the enslaved laborers, remained largely unnamed and unacknowledged. This began changing in the late 20th century as historians paid increasing attention to slavery's role in building Washington and the nation's early infrastructure. Research into construction records, payroll ledgers, and archival documents revealed the extent to which enslaved labor contributed to federal construction projects. The work of documenting enslaved workers' contributions has been painstaking and ongoing. Many historical records didn't name enslaved individuals, referring to them only by count or as property of named owners. Recovering individual names and stories requires cross-referencing multiple documents and carefully reconstructing work assignments. The White House Historical Association has been particularly active in this research. The organization has sponsored scholarly work examining construction records and supporting efforts to identify enslaved workers by name where possible. The goal has been moving beyond acknowledging slavery's role generally to documenting specific individuals' contributions whenever records allow. Some names have been recovered. Historical research has identified certain enslaved individuals who worked on the White House by name, occupation, and sometimes by specific work performed. These names represent only a fraction of the total, but each recovered name represents an individual whose story can be told and whose contribution can be acknowledged. Examples include records of payments to slave owners for Negro hire. The records specify amounts paid and sometimes durations of employment, but the enslaved individuals are usually identified only by first name or sometimes just by count: 3 Negro carpenters or 5 Negro laborers. This documentation style reflected the legal reality that enslaved people were property rather than individuals with full legal standing. They existed in official records as commodities, not as people. The recovery work continues. Researchers examine archives, uncover new documents, and cross-reference information to reconstruct more complete pictures of who worked on the White House and under what conditions.
In recent decades, the White House has incorporated this history into its educational programs and public communications. Tours now discuss the building's construction and acknowledge that enslaved workers were part of the workforce. Educational materials available on the White House website address the topic directly. The approach aims for historically accurate presentation that neither sensationalizes nor minimizes slavery's role. The goal is acknowledging uncomfortable historical reality while providing educational context. Physical recognition has been added as well. In 2016, First Lady Michelle Obama spoke about the significance of living in a house built partly by enslaved workers. Her remarks brought national attention to this aspect of the White House's history. Historical markers have been erected acknowledging enslaved workers' contributions. These markers provide public recognition at the site where the labor occurred. They serve educational purposes and provide tangible acknowledgement of historical reality. The National Park Service, which helps maintain White House grounds, has incorporated this history into interpretive programs. Rangers and guides discussing the White House's history now routinely include information about the diverse workforce, including enslaved workers who built it. Academic research continues expanding understanding of early Washington construction and the labor systems that built the Capitol. Scholars examine archives, uncover new documents, and cross-reference information to reconstruct more complete historical pictures. The effort to acknowledge enslaved workers' contributions represents broader reckoning with slavery's role in American history. The White House, as the nation's most symbolic residence, presents particular challenges and opportunities. Acknowledging that enslaved people helped build it requires confronting uncomfortable contradictions at the heart of American founding. The building was meant to house presidents of a nation founded on liberty and equality, yet enslaved people denied liberty and treated as property helped construct it. This contradiction isn't unique to the White House. It characterizes much early American development. Federal buildings, infrastructure, and institutions were built partly through slave labor, even as the nation proclaimed universal principles of freedom. Modern acknowledgement can't change historical injustice. It can't free people who died in bondage 2 centuries ago. But it can ensure the history isn't forgotten or minimized. The enslaved workers who helped build the White House existed as real individuals with skills, lives, and families. Their contributions were essential to completing the building. Their stories, to the extent they can be recovered, deserve telling. The ongoing research and increasing public acknowledgement represent progress toward more complete historical understanding. The White House's story includes not just presidents and architects, but also the diverse workforce, free and enslaved, whose labor made the building possible. Telling that complete story serves historical accuracy and honors all who contributed. It also provides important lessons about how labor systems shape national development and how historical memory can be expanded to include voices previously excluded. The work continues. More names will be recovered. More stories will be told. The history will become more complete, though it will never be fully complete. Too many records were never created or have been lost. But each name recovered, each story told, each acknowledgement made represents progress toward a more honest reckoning with how the White House and America were built.
Chapter 16. The White House Legacy. What Endures. The White House stands today as one of the world's most recognized buildings. The neoclassical facade, the white columns, the carefully maintained grounds, all create an image that has become synonymous with American democracy and presidential power.
More than 2 centuries of history have shaped both the building and its meaning. But the White House's story begins not with presidents or ceremonies, but with construction. The building rose from difficult ground through years of challenging labor. The timeline from cornerstone to first occupancy stretched 8 years. The work was demanding, dangerous, and difficult. The building represents thousands of hours of human effort that came from diverse sources. Free craftsmen brought skills learned through years of apprenticeship. Immigrants sought opportunity in the growing capital. Enslaved workers, compelled without choice or compensation, provided essential labor. All contributed to raising the structure, though their experiences and compensations were vastly different. James Hoban's design provided the framework, a Georgian structure adapted to Republican purposes. The design balanced grandeur with restraint, creating a building impressive enough to represent a nation, but not so grand as to suggest monarchy. The balance reflected the political sensibilities of the young United States. The building's survival of the 1814 fire and its subsequent reconstruction demonstrated resilience. The decision to rebuild rather than relocate the capital was significant. The restored building, painted white, emerged from destruction to become the structure we recognize today. The burning and reconstruction are as much part of the building's history as its original construction. The White House has been tested by disaster and has endured. This resilience has become part of its symbolic meaning. The building has evolved continuously since completion. Porticos added architectural character. Technological improvements transformed functionality. Interior modifications adapted spaces to changing needs. Each era has left its mark while respecting the original framework. The building's meaning has evolved as well. Initially just the President's House, it became the White House, a name now official and universal. The building represents not just presidential residence, but American executive power generally. The White House announces policies, makes statements, serves as synecdoche for the presidency itself. Understanding the White House's full history requires acknowledging complexity and contradiction. The building represents democratic ideals. It was also built partly through slave labor, a fact that complicates its symbolism. Both aspects are historically true. Neither should be emphasized at the expense of the other. Complete history embraces complexity. It acknowledges achievement while recognizing cost. It celebrates what was built while honoring all who built it, regardless of whether they labored freely or in bondage. For contemporary visitors, the White House functions simultaneously as museum, symbol, and working residence. Tours allow public access to rooms where history unfolded. The building operates continuously as the president's home and workplace. These functions coexist with the building serving multiple purposes that sometimes exist in tension. The White House will continue evolving. Future occupants will make modifications. Technology will advance, requiring new systems and capabilities. The building will adapt while maintaining connection to its origins. This continuity amid change has characterized the structure since completion and will likely continue indefinitely. The ability to remain relevant while maintaining historical character is perhaps the building's most remarkable achievement. The White House's most important legacy may be demonstrating that significant public buildings can endure across centuries while remaining functional and relevant. The structure built between 1792 and 1800 still serves its original purpose over 2 centuries later. This longevity speaks to the quality of Hoban's design and the scale of those who built it. The building connects present to past tangibly. The stone walls standing today include blocks quarried and shaped in the 1790s. The rooms where current presidents work and live are the same spaces Hoban designed. The building provides physical continuity across American history, a structure that has witnessed and housed over 2 centuries of presidential governance. The White House is more than just a building. It's an accumulation of decisions, compromises, labor, and adaptations spanning more than 200 years. It's a structure built by people whose names we know and people whose names we've lost. It's a symbol whose meaning has shifted across generations. But fundamentally, it's a building, stone and timber, plaster and paint, a structure that rose from swampy ground through human effort, a building that burned and was rebuilt, a house that has sheltered families and hosted history. Understanding how the White House was built, who built it, under what conditions, with what materials, facing what challenges, provides foundation for understanding what it has become. The building's history begins with construction. Everything else follows from that beginning.
The cornerstone was laid on October 13, 1792. The first president moved in November 1, 1800. 8 years of construction transformed plans into stone and timber, creating a building that would become one of the world's most recognized structures. But those 8 years were only the beginning. The White House has been continuously modified, maintained, rebuilt, and adapted for more than 2 centuries. The building has evolved while maintaining its essential character, a testament to the strength of Hoban's original design and the quality of work by those who built it. The story of the White House's construction is ultimately a human story. It's about James Hoban adapting Irish-Georgian architecture to American purposes, about skilled craftsmen shaping stone and timber, about enslaved workers compelled to labor on a building meant to symbolize freedom, about political compromises that created a capital from nothing, about resilience after disaster. These human stories, complex, sometimes contradictory, but always revealing, shaped the building that emerged. The White House is what it is because of the people who built it and the circumstances under which they worked. The building stands today painted white, instantly recognizable. Behind that familiar image lies this deeper history, a history of construction and labor, of design and adaptation, of destruction and rebuilding, a history that includes everyone who contributed to creating the structure, regardless of whether they were free or enslaved, acknowledged or forgotten. That fuller, more complicated history is what this documentary has attempted to tell. Not just the story of a building, but the story of how a building came to be. Not just the story of presidents, but the story of workers. Not just the story of achievement, but the story of cost. The White House was built by people. Understanding who those people were, how they worked, and what they experienced provides essential context for understanding the building they created. If you found this exploration of the White House's construction valuable, please subscribe for more documentaries about American architectural and historical subjects. And in the comments, tell me what aspect of the White House's construction surprised you most. What questions do you still have about how this building was built? Thank you for watching. The White House stands as a symbol of American democracy, but it also stands as evidence of human labor, the skilled and the unskilled, the free and the enslaved, all of whom contributed to creating one of the world's most recognizable buildings. Their story deserves to be told. This documentary has been one attempt at that telling.